The sea was silent, but every man aboard could feel it watching. At 2,300 hours, November 14th, 1942, north of Guadalcanal, the Pacific wasn't black, it was void. No moon, no stars. Only the faint green glow of radar screens inside the American battleship USS Washington, the only eyes that could still see. 18,000 yards away, 9 Japanese warships slipped through the darkness, invisible to the naked eye. They believed they were alone. They were wrong. On Washington's SG surface radar, each enemy ship appeared as a trembling point of light, tiny, pulsing echoes in the dark. With every sweep of the antenna, those points moved closer. To the radar operators, it was like watching fate advance frame by frame. The Japanese had searchlights. The Americans had science. For 16 months, the crew of Washington had trained with a technology that few in the Navy fully trusted. The SG radar could detect ships beyond the horizon. The Mark III fire control radar could track them, predict their course, and calculate firing solutions even when the ocean was pitch black. Together, they formed something terrifyingly new, the power to kill unseen. But in 1942, few believed that such power mattered. In every naval manual, in every classroom at the War College, battleships had become relics, hulking guardians for the real weapons of modern war, aircraft carriers. Official doctrine called them floating anti-aircraft platforms. Their purpose was not to fight other ships, but to protect those that did. The men of Washington had spent the last year proving themselves over and over, but never in battle. They'd crossed the Atlantic, served with the British Home Fleet, trained until exhaustion, and yet, in all that time, their 16-inch guns had never fired at an enemy warship. Tonight, that would change. On the bridge, Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee Jr. studied the glowing radar screen, eyes narrowed, hands still. He was 54 years old, short, round-shouldered, and perpetually rumpled. His uniform never fit quite right. His Kentucky drawl made him sound more like a farmer than a warrior. But to those who knew him, he was the deadliest shot in the United States Navy. In the 1920 Olympics, he had won 5 gold medals in shooting. He could put 10 rifle rounds through a single hole at 1,000 yards. And when the Navy gave him a 16-inch gun instead of a rifle, he learned it the same way by instinct. He understood ballistics the way a conductor understands rhythm. Wind, speed, range, they weren't numbers to him. They were music. But Lee's real genius wasn't marksmanship. It was vision. He had seen the future of naval warfare before anyone else. While other admirals dismissed radar as a gadget, Lee saw it as revolution. He rewired Washington's systems, trained his gunnery officers directly with radar operators, cut out middlemen, and created a network that could aim, track, and fire faster than any ship afloat. No one knew if it would work in combat. Tonight would be its first test in the most dangerous waters on Earth. 3 nights earlier, those same waters had swallowed an American task force whole. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's cruisers had fought the Japanese here, in the dark, without radar, without battleships, and the result was a massacre. The night sky had lit up with gunfire. Ships fired at silhouettes they couldn't identify. American gunners shot at friendly vessels in the chaos. By dawn, 4 destroyers were gone, 2 cruisers crippled. Callahan himself was dead. 700 Americans had been killed in a battle that lasted less than an hour. They called it Iron Bottom Sound. Now, as Washington and her small escort slipped through those same black waters, the men could still see oil slicks shimmering across the waves. Wreckage, bodies. The stench of burned paint and fuel still hung in the air. It was a graveyard, and Washington was sailing straight into it. The situation on land was even worse. The Marines on Guadalcanal were hanging by a thread. Their lifeline, the airfield called Henderson Field, was under nightly bombardment. Japanese cruisers came in after dark, shelling the strip into rubble, while American fighters hid in foxholes. If Henderson Field fell, so would Guadalcanal. If Guadalcanal fell, so would the entire Allied line in the South Pacific. Now, radio intercepts had confirmed a new Japanese force was on the way, larger than before. At its heart was the battlecruiser Kirishima, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, armed with 8 14-inch guns and supported by 4 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers. Their mission: flatten Henderson Field, cover the landing of 11,000 fresh Japanese troops, and wipe out the Marines once and for all. Admiral Chester Nimitz, sitting in Pearl Harbor, read the reports in silence. Doctrine told him to keep his battleships close to the carrier Enterprise, the last operational flat top in the Pacific. But Enterprise was damaged. Her flight deck was patched. Her pilots exhausted. If he held his battleships back, Guadalcanal would fall. If he sent them forward, they might never return. He made his decision, and it defied every line of the rulebook. Send them in, alone. That order would land on the desk of Admiral William Halsey, who didn't hesitate. He knew the man to lead this suicide mission. Rear Admiral Willis Ching Lee, the radar man, the gunnery savant, the quiet Kentuckian who understood machines better than doctrine. Lee's force, Task Force 64, would consist of 2 battleships, Washington and South Dakota, and 4 destroyers, Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn. 6 ships against 14. But Lee wasn't counting ships. He was counting seconds. Seconds between radar sweeps, seconds between salvos, seconds between life and death. At sunset, on November 14th, Task Force 64 steamed west of Guadalcanal, their wakes slicing silver against the dying light. Lee ordered all lights out, all radios silent. The ships formed into a long, thin column, 4 destroyers leading, Washington behind them, South Dakota last. To port, the jungle coast glowed faintly with burning fuel tanks. To starboard, the open sea stretched black and endless. As night fell, the temperature dropped. The sound of the engines dulled to a heartbeat thrum. Men spoke in whispers. They were heading into the same stretch of ocean where friends had died 3 nights before. They could feel the ghosts all around them, invisible, waiting. The sailors had started calling these waters Iron Bottom Sound. By dawn, it would earn that name again. On the bridge, Lee leaned over the radar scope, a soft glow washing his face green. Around him, men stood silently at their stations, headphones on, voices hushed. Each sweep of the antenna revealed the shape of the islands, Savo to the north, Guadalcanal to the south, and somewhere out there, beyond the black horizon, the enemy was coming. In the plotting room, the radar operators whispered coordinates to the gunnery officers, calm, methodical, relentless. Range, 18,000 yards. Bearing, 190. Blip by blip, the Japanese formation took shape. Lee's hand hovered over the arm of his chair. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The men could feel his focus, cold, mathematical, absolute. This was the world he understood best. Darkness, distance, data, and the certainty of his guns. In the darkness of the Pacific, where light meant death, one man trusted only the faint pulse of a machine. He had been sent into a graveyard with orders that defied reason to stop an enemy he couldn't see, with weapons no one believed in. And as the first enemy echoes appeared on Washington's radar screens, the Admiral from Kentucky finally had what he had been waiting for, a target. For 20 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained for this moment to own the night. They had made it an art. From the decks of destroyers to the bridges of cruisers, every man in that fleet knew how to fight in darkness, how to see when others could not. They called it Yasen Night Battle, and to the Japanese, it was not simply a tactic. It was destiny. Their lookouts were chosen young, tested again and again for sight and patience. They learned to read the sea like a language, to distinguish a cloud shadow from a ship's silhouette at 10 miles, to judge the wake of a destroyer by the glint of starlight. They memorized silhouettes of every Allied ship by heart. They could identify an enemy by the shape of his masthead, the rhythm of his smoke. At night, while American crews fumbled for binoculars, Japanese sailors could pick out a target by the sound of its engines across the waves. And when they found their target, they killed without hesitation. For that, they carried a weapon unlike anything else on Earth, the Type 93 torpedo, known to the Allies as the Long Lance. Driven by pure oxygen instead of compressed air, it left no visible trail, no wake, no warning. It could run 12 miles at nearly 50 knots, with a 1,000-pound warhead that could break a cruiser in half. To American sailors, The long lance was legend, a weapon too deadly to be real, until it found them. At the battles of Java Sea, Savo Island, Cape Esperance, again and again, Japanese destroyers had struck in the dark, launched their invisible spears, and vanished before the enemy could even aim. The sea would boil with explosions and then silence. By contrast, American doctrine was still trapped in daylight. The U.S. Navy had been built for set-piece battles fought under the sun, where line of battle formations and optical rangefinders ruled. At night, their procedures broke down. They had no radar tactics, no night-fighting schools, no understanding of what was coming for them. After Pearl Harbor, when the Pacific burned, the Navy had scrambled to survive, not innovate. The handful of new battleships that had escaped destruction were tied to carriers, forbidden to fight surface duels. In the words of one officer, "Our battleships are too valuable to risk in the role they were built for." That irony would haunt them, for in Iron Bottom Sound, doctrine killed more men than enemy shells ever did. 3 nights before Lee's task force entered those waters, Admiral Daniel Callahan had gone in without battleships because doctrine said carriers needed their protection more than the Marines needed theirs. He'd faced 2 Japanese battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, with cruisers and destroyers. In the blinding chaos that followed, American ships fired at each other, ramming, colliding, firing blind at muzzle flashes. When morning came, Callahan was dead, his fleet broken, and the Japanese had escaped. Now, the man commanding tonight's Japanese fleet, Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo, knew those waters well. He had studied every reef, every channel, every mile of coastline. He commanded 14 ships, the battle cruiser Kirishima, 4 heavy cruisers, Atago, Takao, Maya, and Suzuya, 2 light cruisers, Nagara and Sendai, and 9 destroyers, each armed with the deadly Type 93. Their orders were simple: destroy Henderson Field, cover the landing of 11,000 troops, end the American foothold once and for all. On paper, Kondo's force outmatched Lee's 6-1. He had nearly triple the firepower, double the speed, and crews trained to perfection. He had won his victories the old-fashioned way, through experience, courage, and the night. He believed the darkness belonged to Japan. He had every reason to. For a generation, Japanese naval officers had practiced under starlight. They turned darkness into ally, not enemy. Their ships were equipped with superior optics, powerful searchlights, and battle tactics designed for close-range annihilation. Their doctrine called for torpedo spreads to be fired in silence, followed by a sudden illumination, searchlights snapping on all at once, turning night into daylight, blinding their enemies moments before the kill. And tonight, Kondo expected another easy hunt. What he didn't know, what no one in the Imperial Navy knew, was that the Americans had brought something else into the dark, something no amount of eyesight could match: radar. Inside Washington's Combat Information Center, the SG radar hummed quietly, sweeping the darkness. Every rotation drew green lines across the scope, marking the world in light. To the men watching, the Japanese fleet wasn't invisible at all. It was there, perfectly outlined, perfectly tracked. Every range and bearing whispered over the intercom. They knew where every destroyer was, every cruiser. Even the shape of Savo Island loomed on the display, a ghostly outline in green phosphor. It was as if the Americans had been given sight beyond sight. But even radar couldn't fix everything. Lee's Task Force 64 was a patchwork of systems and crews. South Dakota, his second battleship, had just arrived from repairs in the States. Her crew was green. Many had never even seen the Pacific. Her radar equipment was different from Washington's. Their radio frequencies didn't match. Even their recognition signals were incompatible. Lee didn't discover this until after they were already at sea. He had to jury-rig a new communication system on the fly, using signal lamps and pre-arranged maneuvers. If radio silence broke, if confusion spread, if one ship misread a signal, the battle would unravel instantly. And that wasn't the only weakness. The 4 destroyers leading the column, Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwyn, were outgunned and out-armored. Their 5-inch guns were no match for Japanese cruisers. Their only real weapons were torpedoes, short-range, last resort weapons. To use them, They would have to close to within 10,000 yards, well inside enemy gunnery range. Everyone aboard knew what that meant. For the destroyer crews, this mission wasn't a fight. It was a sacrifice. As night fell over the Pacific, Lee's formation slipped silently past the western tip of Guadalcanal. The last glimmers of sunset disappeared behind the islands, and darkness settled like a shroud. The column stretched more than 2 miles long, 6 ships gliding in perfect silence, heading into waters already thick with oil and ghosts. Sailors stared into the black, seeing nothing, hearing only the thrum of engines and the occasional hiss of steam. Below decks, some wrote quick letters home, others sat quietly, listening to the creak of steel. They called these waters Iron Bottom Sound for a reason. More ships lay beneath than still sailed above. And before dawn, more would join them. In Tokyo, the Japanese believed the Americans were finished. Their propaganda called Guadalcanal a grave for the white barbarians. They didn't know that 2 American battleships were coming for them, or that one of them carried an admiral who understood the future. Lee's advantage was radar. Kondo's was experience. Both would soon discover which one ruled the night. In the Combat Information Center, Lee's radar team began to pick up faint signals, small blips moving in formation, 20 miles out. Contacts. Enemy destroyers sweeping ahead of the main force. Lee studied the scope. He could see their range decreasing 18,000 yards, 16,000, 14,000. At that distance, the Japanese lookouts should have already spotted the American ships. But they hadn't. Their eyes searched the horizon, expecting aircraft, not battleships. That would be their first mistake. Lee's voice broke the silence. Hold fire. Let them come closer. The order rippled through Washington's decks, a whisper of steel against breath. Men at the guns waited, sweating in the dark, every muscle coiled. The radar operators kept calling the range. 13,000, 12,000, 10,000. Soon, the 2 fleets would occupy the same patch of ocean. The Japanese, masters of the night, were sailing into an ambush they couldn't see. For a generation, the darkness had belonged to Japan. But on this night, the Pacific would belong to whoever could see first, and kill fastest. In the control room of USS Washington, Admiral Willis Lee leaned over his radar screen and watched the future unfold in green light. He knew what was coming. The Japanese did not. And in that difference in the space between sight and blindness, the outcome of the Pacific War was about to shift forever. The radar blip arrived like a rumor in the dark, faint, steady, undeniable. On Washington's plotting board it was a small, green heartbeat, then another, then a line of them marching closer. Men at the scopes barely breathed. Contacts, said the plotter. Range, 18,000 yards. Bearing 185. Lee did not startle. He had trained for this. He had built a system that turned electronics into ordnance. Still, the room hummed with tension. 6 ships, a dozen stations, and a single purpose: kill before you are killed. Outside, the night was absolute. Searchlights far off banked and died like fireflies. Black water closed over the wake. The Japanese formation, cruising toward Guadalcanal, kept its own lights low. They expected only aircraft, PT boats, perhaps a submarine they did not expect, 2 battleships sliding into the dark. Lee held his cards. He had 2 blunt choices: break the silence and fire from extreme range, announce their presence and force the enemy to scatter or wait, let the Japanese commit to their mission, and spring a trap when retreat was impossible. Each option carried its own death. The radar told him something else. The Japanese looked confident, organized, but not searching the sectors behind them. Their lookouts scanned the shoreline, expecting naval gunfire or air attacks on Henderson Field. No one glanced back into the black. Hold fire, Lee ordered. It was a decision born of patience and cruelty. The longer the Japanese came, the less room they would have to run. Lee wanted them to close to a range where Washington's radar-directed guns would be devastating and unavoidable. The distances ticked down. The destroyers ahead of Kondo's main body, the van, were first. Their silhouettes showed as thin slivers on the screen. Their spread suggested a sweep intended to clear the approaches. They were the tip of the spear. 10,000, 8,000. On Washington's decks, the gunners felt time stretch. Men sweat in wool uniforms beneath the dome of the turret. Fingers found familiar grooves in steel. There was a ritual to waiting: clean a shell's fuse, check a training gear, mutter a prayer. On the bridge, Lee's jaw was a white line. At exactly 2,300 hours, he gave the order that would split the night. Open fire. The first salvo was ceremonial and absolute. 9 16-inch barrels coughed with weight and fury. The world inhaled, then the concussion rolled across the sea. Projectiles the size of small houses rose into the black and began their silent arc toward the enemy. For 23 seconds they flew. To the men who fired them, there was no sight of impact, only the hush, then the faint tremor as water columns rose where they landed. The first round missed its primary aim, the light cruiser Sendai, but it landed close enough to wash seawater across her deck. Close was enough to cause confusion. Confusion was a weapon. The second salvo shifted to a destroyer that led the van. This time Washington's gunnery could see what the Japanese could not. Radar-directed fire closed the loop between detection and destruction. A 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell slammed through thin plating, detonated in the engineering spaces. The destroyer's lights flicked out, then the ship staggered and burned. Men were thrown into the dark like rag dolls. Explosions bloomed. Smoke became a curtain. Searchlights snapped on in every direction as the Japanese sought the source of the surprise. For a moment, the night looked like twilight at noon, a dozen pinprick beams stabbing the black, searching for answers. The American destroyers reacted as they were trained to do. They charged a bayonet charge of small, fast ships to close with the enemy and launch torpedoes. It was a sacrificial role. Their 5-inch guns could not keep up with cruiser broadsides. Walk, Preston, Benham, and Gwyn surged forward, engines screaming, torpedo crews praying over tubes that had fed 1,000 nightmares. Japanese star shells rose overhead, blooming into greenish-white light that turned the sea into a cauldron. Tracers stitched bright veins across the water. The sound of battle was layered, the low, monstrous thump of battleship salvos, the nervous rat-a-tat of 5-inch batteries, the shriek of shells finding thin steel. The destroyers paid the price for boldness. Preston, striking toward the enemy to give the big guns a chance, took the brunt of that first storm. Shells found thin plating, ruptured fuel lines, and set fire to wooden decks. She burned, and then, horror of horrors, a magazine detonation ripped her apart in a single white blossom of fire. Her bow disappeared. Sailors were flung into the sea like toys. Walk kept on. She drove for the line, turned to launch torpedoes, only to be hammered by concentrated cruiser fire. A torpedo, a Japanese long lance, found her and shattered her keel. She split and sank rapidly. Men clambered for life rafts that were already burning. Benham took a torpedo amidships. Her bow was blown off like paper. Gwyn was hit again and again, but held power and tried to withdraw, snatching survivors as she fled. The destroyer screen, meant to be a shield, had become a pyre. Back on Washington, the gunnery teams kept swinging. Radar operators fed constant corrections. Range, bearing, fall of shot. The Mark III directed each gun like a conductor shaping an orchestra. Where visual spotters would have been lost, the radioed corrections tightened accuracy. Where optics failed, machines told the truth. But even perfection has its enemies. At 23-7, South Dakota, trailing 2 miles astern, suffered a failure that turned a capable ally into a cripple. A single misthrow of the main electrical circuit breakers by an overworked engineer plunged the ship into darkness. Her generators went down. Her radar screens died. Her gun directors lost electrical guidance. Ammunition hoists stalled. Within seconds, South Dakota became a glowing target. Silhouette visible. Lights from burning destroyers and gunfire painting her in hellfire. Japanese searchlights locked on. The enemy gunners, disciplined and precise, found her and fed her a terrible, concentrated punishment. 7, then 12, then more shells struck home. They smashed through superstructures and tore away antennas and radars. The big ship shuddered as if punched in the throat. The men inside felt the metal cry as steel twisted and splintered. Her secondary batteries stopped. Her communications were knotted in sparks and smoke, casualties mounted. 38 dead and scores wounded within the first furious minutes. Lee watched it happen with a face like flint. Every textbook now urged withdrawal. A blind ship could not be left alone to burn. The safe, conventional move would have been to pull back, to regroup, and to live to fight another day. But Washington still had its eyes. The Japanese, intoxicated with hits and convinced of victory, scattered to finish off the destroyers and the crippled South Dakota. In their frenzy, they lost formation. In their focus on wallets of prey, they failed to notice the shadow that had shifted position in the melee. Washington glided through the smoke and burning wreckage like a blade through fog. Lee's radar painted each Japanese vessel's position with mathematical chill. Bearings, ranges, relative motion. Where they were blind, he saw, and where they moved, he calculated. The enemy thought darkness protected them. Instead, it hid them from themselves while Washington watched, waited, and prepared to strike where the night had once protected. In the first terrible minutes, the sea had given its answer. Small ships died to save big ones. Fire and Steel wrote a short, brutal paragraph of history. And in the smoke, one battleship remained whole, watching, counting, waiting for the precise moment to turn confusion into catastrophe. The Pacific did not roar that night. It screamed. Fire leapt across Iron Bottom Sound. Green, red, and orange reflected on water thick with oil. The wreckage of American destroyers burned like floating lanterns, their flames dancing in the salt wind, and through that inferno limped the battleship South Dakota, blind, deaf, and alone. At 23:07, a minor electrical fault had become catastrophe. Somewhere deep inside the ship, an engineer trying to reset a power circuit had accidentally tripped the main breakers. It was an instant of human error, and it stripped a warship of her senses. The lights died. The radar screens went dark. The gun directors froze mid-turn. Ventilation stopped. For the men inside, it was like being sealed in a metal coffin. Captain Thomas Gatch barked orders from the bridge, but there was only the smell of hot metal and the sound of breakers snapping. Within seconds, emergency diesel generators thudded to life, but they could power only fragments. The bridge, a few communication lines, the compass, everything else, the radar, the rangefinders, the ammunition lifts, stayed dead. And the Japanese were watching. Searchlights from the battle cruiser Kirishima snapped on, first sharp, white daggers cutting through smoke. Then the cruisers Otago and Takao followed, each beam locking on to the dark shape of South Dakota's hull. In an instant, the American battleship was illuminated like an actor under a dozen stage lamps. Against that blinding glare, her silhouette was unmistakable, a perfect target. The first salvo came from Kirishima's 14-inch guns. 3 bright flashes tore across the horizon, followed by the distant rumble of impact. The shells landed short, great plumes of water rising around the battleship, but the next found home. A shell smashed through her superstructure, exploding amid communications gear. Another hit the aft director tower, shredding radar arrays and scattering shrapnel through the crew compartments. Fragments sliced across open decks, sending men spinning to the steel. Moments later, the cruisers joined in. 10 8-inch guns from Otago and Takao began a relentless rhythm, hurling armor-piercing shells into South Dakota's upper works. Each impact was a hammer blow. One ripped away her radio masts, another smashed the portside 5-inch battery. Explosions flared across her bridge wings, painting the ship in flashes of orange and blue. Inside the conning tower, smoke filled the air. Captain Gatch was hit by a piece of metal the size of a coin shrapnel that tore into his throat. He fell, clutching blood and cordite, but refused to leave his post. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, stood again, and kept shouting orders through the din. On the lower decks, sailors fought fires with bare hands, tossing sand and rags into flames that crept along bulkheads. Electrical sparks set clothing alight. Men carried the wounded down passageways, lit only by emergency lanterns. Some prayed. Others cursed the darkness. No one panicked. They were the newest crew in the fleet, but they fought like veterans that night. Above them, the Japanese gunners tightened their aim. Kirishima's spotters corrected for range, adjusting fire by the second. Every 30 seconds came another salvo, a blinding flash, the whistle, the impact. South Dakota's armor absorbed the punishment, but her superstructure was being shredded. She was losing antennas, radars, rangefinders, secondary guns, everything that made her a weapon rather than a target. In less than 2 minutes, she took 27 major hits. Metal screamed, glass shattered, and the smell of burned paint filled the air. Men were thrown from their stations. Power conduits sparked like lightning snakes across corridors. From Washington, 2 miles away, Lee and his bridge crew watched it all through binoculars and radar readouts. They saw the enemy's lights converge on their sister ship. They saw South Dakota stagger under the combined fire of an entire fleet. For a heartbeat, Lee's officers expected the order to retreat, to cover her withdrawal, to regroup. But Lee's voice was calm, almost cold. He understood what the Japanese could not. Washington was invisible. The Japanese were so fixated on the burning South Dakota that they had forgotten to look elsewhere. Their searchlights, their gunfire, their torpedoes all pointed toward that one glowing beacon in the night, and behind it, in the shadow of its fire, another battleship was stalking them. On South Dakota, damage control officers finally restored partial power. Gun turrets came alive in local control, meaning each battery fired by its own crew's judgment, without central direction, without radar. They aimed by instinct, by flashes, by the naked eye. The great 16-inch guns bellowed once more, throwing shells back toward the lights that had tortured them. Each salvo was a defiant heartbeat in a sea of chaos. But Lee knew she was finished for this fight. Her radios were gone. She couldn't hear orders or send them. Her steering was erratic. Her decks a patchwork of fire and debris. He turned to his operations officer and spoke a line that would echo through naval lore. South Dakota's blind. We'll take the lead. In the Japanese flagship, Admiral Kondo believed he was witnessing the death of both American battleships. He saw burning wreckage everywhere. His lookouts reported 4 destroyers destroyed, 1 battleship crippled, and another retreating. He assumed victory. He didn't realize that Washington, the true threat, had never fired a shot since the first salvo. Her radar still tracked the entire Japanese line, calculating movements, logging bearings with perfect precision. While the Japanese turned to finish off the wounded, Washington maneuvered silently through the drifting smoke and debris. Her black hull blended into the horizon, her radar eyes unblinking. The storm of fire focused on South Dakota became her camouflage. The battle had turned, but no one knew it yet. Aboard the burning American ships, it looked like defeat. Aboard the Japanese cruisers, it felt like triumph. Only one man in Iron Bottom Sound could see the truth, glowing in the green light of a radar screen. Admiral Willis Lee watched the chaos resolve into order his order. Every Japanese ship was now out of formation, overlapping arcs of fire like tangled vines. Sendai had drifted too far west. Kirishima had slowed to chase South Dakota. The cruisers had spread apart in the pursuit. Their tight, disciplined formation was gone. It was the opportunity he had been waiting for. But to take it, he would have to do something no admiral had ever attempted: charge alone into the center of an enemy fleet. In less than 15 minutes, the American destroyers had been erased. South Dakota battered, burning, fought blind and silent. The Japanese believed the night was theirs. But somewhere in that darkness, a single battleship was waiting unseen, untouched, and guided by the cold precision of radar. And her commander was about to break every rule of naval warfare. The sea was on fire, and yet within that inferno, one ship moved like a ghost. While South Dakota burned beneath the white spears of Japanese searchlights, USS Washington slipped unseen through the wreckage. Her hull was black against the darker horizon, her wake hidden in the smoke of dying ships. On the radar screens, the enemy appeared as a swarm of green motes, disordered, overlapping, blind. Admiral Willis Lee stood over the glowing scope, one hand resting on the edge of the plotting table. Around him, voices whispered data. Kirishima, bearing 325, range 15,000, 13,000, closing fast. Lee's eyes didn't blink. He could feel the rhythm of the enemy's motion, every turn, every hesitation. He had been trained for this moment all his life, though no manual had ever written it down. The decision came quietly. "We're going in. Maximum speed. Course 030. The helmsman repeated the order, his voice barely audible. Washington began to turn, great turbines surging, the deck trembling underfoot. Her bow cut through the smoke at 26 knots. The destroyers were gone, South Dakota crippled. The flagship was alone now, closing on 14 enemy ships. Inside the plotting room, the radar operators guided her like surgeons. 15,000 yards. 12,000. Lee's gunnery officer called out corrections. The Mark 8 fire control computer whirred a mechanical brain-crunching range, speed, wind, and target course. Every variable converged into a single set of numbers. Elevation, plus lead angle, plus time of flight. At 8400 yards, the Admiral gave the command that would etch his name into naval history. Commence firing. 9 16-inch guns thundered as one. The concussion punched the air. Dust and smoke rolled across the deck. 45 tons of steel leapt into the night. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the horizon erupted in white fire. The first salvo straddled Kirishima, plumes of water towering over her bridge. The second found the range. One shell slammed through her forward turret, detonating inside. Another tore into her engine room. The third salvo landed square amidships, punching a hole large enough to drive a truck through. The Japanese flagship shuddered. Her searchlights flickered, then died. Flames rose from her decks, feeding on paint and oil. Inside, boilers burst. Steam scalded men before they could scream. Washington fired again, and again, and again. In 7 minutes, she hurled 75 16-inch shells, the fastest, most accurate battleship gunnery of the Pacific War. Each impact was a small apocalypse. Shells weighing 2,700 pounds hit at over 2,000 feet per second, freight trains of explosive steel. Armor that had shrugged off cruiser fire now folded like tin. Fragments scythed through machinery, through bulkheads, through men. One shell struck below the waterline, flooding 3 compartments. Another smashed the steering gear, locking the rudder hard to port. Kirishima began to circle helplessly, her guns firing wild, her fate sealed. Lee watched the radar plot flatten into chaos. The enemy flagship's motion slowed, her echo smeared and drifted. He knew what that meant. "She's finished," he said quietly. "Shift fire." Washington's secondary batteries joined in 25-inch guns, lashing Kirishima's upper decks, cutting down what was left of her crew. Tracers stitched the night. Explosions rolled like thunder over water. Aboard Kirishima, Captain Iwabuchi Sanji refused to abandon ship. Blood streaked his face as he shouted orders through choking smoke. Men carried wounded comrades to the rails, singing the Japanese anthem through tears. But no order, no courage, could save her. The ship that had bombarded Pearl Harbor was dying. Meanwhile, the Japanese cruisers Atago and Takao swung their searchlights toward the new threat. For the first time, they saw Washington a mountain of steel illuminated in the reflected glow of their own burning flagship. They fired 8-inch guns barking, shells hissing across the water. Torpedo crews rushed to their tubes, launching 16 long lances in a fan toward the shadow. Lee's radar operators saw them leave. Torpedo spread in the water bearing 270, closing fast. Lee didn't hesitate. Hard to starboard, flank speed. The battleship heeled as she turned. Waves broke white across the bow. Men braced against bulkheads. On radar, the torpedo wakes appeared as faint ripples of interference. The helm adjusted by inches, by seconds. One passed 50 yards astern. Another exploded harmlessly in Washington's wake. All 16 missed. Now the hunter turned on the hunters. At 12,000 yards, Washington's main battery shifted to Atago. The first salvo splashed just short. The second straddled. Columns of water drenched the cruiser's bridge. One fragment tore through her radio shack, killing the communications officer outright. Kondo's illusion of victory dissolved. In minutes, his flagship was crippled, his cruisers under fire, his formation broken. He could not even count how many American battleships were shooting at him. 1, 2, 3. The devastation felt impossible from a single ship. He gave the only order left. All units withdraw north. At 0:20, the Japanese fleet turned away. engines laboring, torpedoes still in tubes, guns silent. Behind them, Kirishima burned alone, listing 15 degrees, steam venting from her torn funnels. Damage control parties fought until the decks were ankle-deep in water. When they could fight no longer, Captain Iwabuchi gathered his men on the slanted forecastle. They sang one last verse for the Emperor, gave 3 banzai cheers, and stepped into the sea. At 3:20 a.m., the battle cruiser rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves. 300 men went with her. Washington did not pursue. Her magazines were half spent, her secondary guns glowing red, her decks slick with powder residue. Lee turned his ship north, away from the killing ground. Radio silence had been his shield, but now it was a danger. American PT boats prowled ahead, primed to attack anything that moved. Lee broke silence only once. "This is Ching Lee. Get out of my way, I'm coming through." The torpedo boats held fire. The path home opened. As dawn bled over the Solomon Islands, Iron Bottom Sound lay still again. Smoke drifted low on the water. The wrecks of Walk and Preston burned themselves out. Farther south, South Dakota limped away, alive but scarred. Washington alone was unscathed. Not a single man aboard her had been killed. Only one shell, a stray 5-inch round, had struck her, slicing through a radio antenna and nothing more. The most violent surface battle of the Pacific War had ended with one ship standing, unbroken, untouched. In 7 minutes of perfect gunnery, a single battleship had destroyed a Japanese battlecruiser, shattered a fleet, and rewritten the rules of war. Her victory came not from numbers or luck, but from training, technology, and the calm mind of one man who trusted what others feared to use. The darkness no longer belonged to Japan. It belonged to radar. By dawn, the guns had fallen silent. The black water of Iron Bottom Sound shimmered grey in the new light, calm, deceptive, almost peaceful. But beneath that stillness lay twisted steel, broken masts, drifting oil, and the dead of both fleets. In the faint morning haze, USS Washington turned slowly north. Smoke still curled from her barrels, her decks slick with residue and dew. Men who had not slept in 30 hours leaned against bulkheads, eyes bloodshot, hands trembling from the echo of recoil. They had fired more than any American battleship ever had in a single night. They had won, but victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like silence. Across the sea, the wreckage of the destroyers Walk and Preston still burned. Where they had once stood in formation, now only oil slicks and floating debris marked their graves. Hundreds of sailors clung to rafts or driftwood, faces pale beneath the soot, calling faintly for help as Washington passed by. The ocean carried their voices like ghosts rising and fading in the wind. Lee ordered lookouts posted along the rails. Whenever a survivor was spotted, he slowed the great battleship just enough for rescue boats to lower. Men pulled other men aboard, wrapped them in blankets, pressed canteens into shaking hands. No one spoke. They had seen too much. To the south, South Dakota was limping away, scarred, scorched, but afloat. Her entire superstructure looked as if a giant had clawed it open. Radar arrays hung twisted like broken bones, gun barrels bent and blackened from heat. Smoke poured from every vent. Yet she lived. Inside her hull, teams were already patching leaks, extinguishing fires, and counting the missing. 38 men had been killed, 59 wounded, and yet somehow the ship that had been the Japanese fleet's punching bag would survive to fight again. Her captain, Thomas Gatch, was alive too pale, blood on his collar, throat bandaged where shrapnel had struck him. When a young sailor begged him to rest, he shook his head. "Not yet," he rasped. "We're not finished yet." The destroyer Gwyn, the only one still under power, crept through the battlefield at reduced speed. Her decks were pitted with shell holes, her paint burned away, but her engines still answered the helm. She moved through the wreckage like a funeral procession, plucking survivors from the oil-covered water. From the twisted bow of Benham, which had been blown nearly in half, men waved weakly until rescue boats reached them. Some refused to leave their ship until ordered. By mid-morning, Benham herself was gone, scuttled to prevent capture. In less than 1 hour of combat, 3 destroyers had been erased. 400 American sailors were dead. Dozens more floated, wounded, waiting for rescue that would take days. And yet, compared to what could have been to what should have been the price, was a miracle. At Henderson Field, the Marines woke to the echo of gunfire fading over the sea. They had spent the night crouched in foxholes, convinced the Japanese bombardment would come again. Instead, as the first light reached the beaches, they saw black smoke rising offshore and American planes still on the runway. The sound of engines warming brought cheers from the trenches. By mid-morning, Wildcats and dauntless dive bombers were clawing into the sky. Radar from the airfield picked up a cluster of retreating contacts to the north, the Japanese troop transports that had been waiting for Kirishima's guns to silence the airfield. They were exposed, now stripped of protection, their decks crowded with soldiers. The Marines watched as squadrons of bombers circled out to sea, sunlight flashing on their wings. Within hours, the ocean erupted again, not with gunfire, but with explosions from above. One by one, the Japanese transports were hit. 7 transports sank. 4 more were left blazing, adrift, or run aground on the reefs. Of the 11,000 Japanese troops they carried, only 4,000 reached Guadalcanal's shores, many without rifles, without ammunition, without food. They would spend the next month starving in the jungle. Guadalcanal had been saved, not by planes, not by doctrine, but by a single night's defiance. By midday, Admiral Lee's Task Force 64 had cleared the battle area. Washington and South Dakota rendezvoused east of Savo Island, joined by a few surviving destroyers. The sea was calm again, but the men aboard both ships were not. Exhaustion hit like gravity. After hours of standing at battle stations, men collapsed where they stood asleep beside the guns, curled under bulkheads, helmets still on. Medics moved quietly among them, patching burns and dressing cuts. The cooks brewed coffee so strong it tasted like metal. When Lee finally stepped out onto the deck, dawn had turned the sea silver. He looked out at the horizon where the smoke of the Japanese fleet still smudged the sky. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, to no one in particular, he murmured, "That's what radar was built for." Messages flashed across the Pacific that morning. From the Solomon Islands to Pearl Harbor, from Pearl to Washington, the Navy's communication lines carried fragments of a story that few could believe. Japanese battleships sunk, enemy force driven off. No damage to Washington. At first, the reports were treated with skepticism. How could one battleship operating alone, without carrier support, annihilate an entire enemy bombardment group? But the evidence was undeniable. Wreckage, radio intercepts, Japanese transmissions calling for rescue. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz read the dispatches in silence. He had gambled against doctrine and won. Then came a single message from Admiral William Halsey, commander of the South Pacific Force, to Lee. "You and your task force have written a glorious page in American naval history." Lee didn't frame it. He filed it away. For him, the measure of success wasn't glory, it was survival. And Washington had brought every man home. Below decks, sailors talked quietly as they cleaned the guns and swabbed powder residue from the decks. They spoke of the destroyers that had vanished ahead of them, of the green light of radar, of the moment the ship had fired blind into darkness and hit with impossible precision. Some called it luck, others said it was skill. The truth was somewhere in between. They had done what no one believed possible. They had fought a fleet they couldn't see, in waters filled with ghosts, and walked away unscathed. In Tokyo, the reaction was disbelief. Admiral Nobutake Kondo filed his initial report, claiming that Kirishima had been sunk by American cruisers and destroyers. He could not imagine that one battleship had inflicted such ruin. It wasn't until days later, when intercepted American radio traffic confirmed Washington's role, that the Japanese Navy accepted the truth. The psychological shock was enormous. For the first time in the Pacific War, a Japanese battleship had been defeated not by aircraft, not by submarines, but in a surface duel, by another battleship. And that defeat had come at night, in the element they had believed invincible. Back aboard Washington, Captain Glenn Davis compiled the battle report. His language was calm: clinical distances, bearings, number of salvos fired, rounds expended, observed hits. But buried within the numbers was a quiet revolution. He wrote that radar fire control had made possible continuous and effective fire in total darkness, that the system reduced the human element in aiming to the minimum, and that it proved decisive in the action. It was the first time in naval history that radar had directed the destruction of an enemy capital ship. Lee reviewed the report and signed his name at the bottom. He knew what it meant. He also knew how easily the lesson could be ignored. That night, after 24 hours without sleep, Lee gathered his senior officers in the wardroom. He thanked them quietly, no speech, no theatrics. He raised a cup of coffee, not champagne. "We did what had to be done," he said simply. "And we brought them home." Then he dismissed the meeting and went to his cabin. He did not sleep. He sat at his desk, reading reports, replaying every decision, every shell, every order. The victory was complete, but he felt no celebration, only the weight of what came next. He had proven that the old doctrines were wrong. He had shown that radar, the machine so many had dismissed, could win battles, save lives, and change war itself. Now he had to convince the Navy of it. The following morning, Washington entered the harbor at Noumea, New Caledonia, for resupply. Crowds gathered on the pier, expecting a ship scarred and smoking. Instead, they saw a battleship, immaculate paint, still fresh, guns at rest, flags snapping in the wind. The contrast stunned them. Her crew stood at attention along the rails, uniforms clean, eyes hollow with exhaustion but proud. No funerals, no wounded stretchered ashore. For the first time in living memory, a battleship that had fought a major surface engagement returned with 0 combat fatalities. Not a single man aboard Washington had been killed. The fact spread through the fleet like legend. It was the miracle of Iron Bottom Sound, the impossible victory of one ship that refused to die, one admiral who refused to obey outdated rules. The Marines on Guadalcanal would live, the airfield would stand, and the tide of the Pacific War for the first time began to turn. But behind the glory, in the calm that followed the storm, new battles were waiting, not at sea, but in offices, in reports, in the halls of command. Battles not of gunfire, but of belief, because the Navy that owed its survival to radar wasn't ready to admit that the world had changed. When the guns fell silent, a different kind of war began. Not a war of steel and smoke, but of memos, egos, and paper. USS Washington had fought a perfect battle. Her radar had rewritten tactics in 7 minutes, but in Washington, D.C., half a world away, the revolution she'd proven was already being buried. The first reports reached Pearl Harbor within days. Captain Glenn Davis's after-action summary was a masterpiece of understatement. Radar fire control was continuous and effective throughout the action. Enemy targets were engaged and destroyed in darkness without visual contact. That single paragraph described the birth of a new age of naval warfare. It should have electrified the fleet. Instead, it was quietly filed away, classified, red-taped, and forgotten beneath newer reports about carriers, air groups, and logistics. For the High Command, battleships were relics. Their redemption did not fit the story the Navy wanted to tell. After Midway, carrier aviation had become gospel. Every admiral who mattered wore wings. Their message was simple: air power had won the Pacific, and nothing else would ever matter again. Washington's victory threatened that narrative. If one battleship could fight alone and win, then perhaps doctrine itself was wrong. And no institution likes to be told it is wrong. Admiral Willis Lee understood this. He had lived through the bureaucratic battles long before the shooting ones. He knew that in the Navy's hierarchy, innovation was tolerated only when it confirmed existing beliefs. His victory did not. When he returned to Pearl Harbor, there were no parades, no headlines, no interviews. Reporters wrote about a successful defensive action. Official communiques called it the repulse of an enemy bombardment. Nowhere did they mention that Washington had single-handedly sunk a battleship and scattered an entire fleet. Lee didn't complain. He poured his energy into writing a series of technical memoranda, calm, analytical papers on radar, fire control integration, night fighting doctrine, and real-time data transmission. He laid out in precise, measured terms how the fleet could transform itself. Most of those papers were never circulated. They sat in drawers while the Navy raced toward its next battle. Meanwhile, the ships themselves were changing. The Pacific campaign rolled north and west. Gilberts, Marshalls, Marianas. Washington sailed in nearly every operation, her guns booming in support of landings at Kwajalein, Saipan, and later. But her role had been reduced. She was now an anti-aircraft escort, tethered to carrier groups like a guard dog on a leash. Her radar, her range, her killing power all pointed upward toward the sky, defending others. She would never again engage an enemy surface ship. It wasn't that the Navy forgot how to fight at night. It simply decided it didn't need to. Victory can blind as surely as defeat. After 1943, American success became its own doctrine. The lesson of Guadalcanal, the lesson of innovation born in desperation, was drowned out by triumphal certainty. In private letters to colleagues, Lee tried to warn them. He wrote that radar was not a convenience but a weapon, that its potential went far beyond detection. He urged the creation of specialized radar gunnery schools, of integrated control centers, where data, fire control, and command could merge into a single decision network. What he envisioned was decades ahead of its time. A digitally linked fleet, where information moved faster than enemy fire. But in 1943, few listened. The Navy's focus had shifted to mass production, not experimentation. There was no appetite for revolution amid victory parades. By 1944, Lee had been promoted to Vice Admiral, commanding the fast battleship force 6 giants: Washington, North Carolina, South Dakota, Indiana, Alabama, and Massachusetts. They were magnificent, modern, and largely unused. Whenever they requested permission to operate independently, the answer was the same. Negative, remain with carriers. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Lee's line steamed hundreds of miles ahead of its time, able to strike Japanese surface forces that never appeared because they'd been destroyed by aircraft first. When the enemy did surface again, at Leyte Gulf, his battleships were sent chasing phantom carriers, while escort destroyers fought and died alone at Samar. Lee watched through clenched teeth as tactical opportunities slipped away, opportunities his radar could have exploited with surgical precision. He obeyed orders, but inside he knew the Navy had learned nothing. After the war, he was still trying to teach. He gave lectures to junior officers about information warfare before the phrase existed. He explained that radar was not just eyes, it was intelligence, a means to think faster than the enemy. He described the battle off Guadalcanal not as luck, but as the inevitable result of preparation meeting technology. Few in the audience understood how prophetic he was. Within 20 years, his ideas would become the blueprint for the Aegis combat system, linking sensors and weapons into one seamless network, the very thing he'd described in 1942. But Lee never saw it. On August 25, 1945, 10 days after Japan surrendered, Vice Admiral Willis A. Lee Jr. died of a sudden heart attack aboard a launch bound for his flagship, the training battleship Wyoming, in Casco Bay, Maine. He was 57. The crew tried to revive him for 20 minutes. When they carried his body ashore, the war he had helped to win was already shifting into memory. News of his death reached Washington with little fanfare. The Navy released a short statement noting his distinguished service. His Olympic medals were mentioned. His victory at Guadalcanal received one sentence. Admiral Chester Nimitz called him one of the finest officers I have ever known. Admiral William Halsey said his tactical genius saved countless American lives. But within months, those tributes were archived, the war ending not with memory, but with amnesia. Lee's reports on radar fire control remained classified until the 1,950 seconds. By then, the world had moved on to jets and missiles. Battleships were being scrapped for metal. USS Washington returned to New York in 1947. Her paint was faded, her decks worn by years of hard service. She was decommissioned quietly. No bands, no speeches. For 14 years she sat in the reserve fleet, tied to a pier, rust creeping across her armour. In 1960, her name was struck from the Naval Register. A year later, she was sold for $544,000 less than the cost of one of her propellers. On May 24, 1961, she was cut apart by torches at Kearney, New Jersey. Her steel became razor blades, bridge girders, and rebar. No memorial was built. No museum preserved her. The ship that had saved Guadalcanal vanished like a rumor swallowed by time. Institutions rarely honor the heretics who save them. The Battle of Guadalcanal was won by courage and radar, but history credited doctrine and destiny. The Navy did not willfully forget Washington's victory, it simply found it inconvenient. The carrier era had arrived, and battleships belonged to the past. Admitting otherwise meant reopening every assumption that officers had built their careers upon. So, the story of Washington became a footnote. Her crew dispersed, her admiral gone, her lesson unlearned. Yet, not all was lost. A handful of young officers who had served under Lee carried his ideas forward. They wrote training manuals on radar plotting, advocated for centralized combat information centers, and helped design the first shipboard computers of the 1,950 seconds. Their efforts created the nervous system of the modern fleet. By the 1,970 seconds, the Aegis system linking sensors, computers, and weapons would realize exactly what Lee had envisioned, a ship that could fight beyond visual range, react instantly, and dominate a battlefield where the enemy was blind. In a sense, the ghost of Washington still sails every time a missile cruiser tracks a target through fog or darkness. Her DNA lives in the code that fuses radar returns with firing solutions. Her heartbeat echoes in the digital pulse of every modern warship. But the Navy never built another monument to her crew. They never raised a hull plate for display, never placed a plaque over her resting place. Most Americans know the names Arizona and Missouri, the bookends of the war. Few know the name Washington, the ship that changed its middle chapters. The tragedy is not merely that her story was forgotten, but that her example could have saved lives later. At Empress Augusta Bay, at Samar, at countless smaller actions, American ships fought at night without the training Lee had tried to institutionalize. Radar was present, but its potential remained half understood, its operators undervalued. Each lost destroyer, each burning cruiser, was a reminder of the lesson ignored. Every revolution faces resistance not from the enemy, but from within. In 1942, the enemy had been Japan. After 1942, the enemy was inertia. The Navy that prided itself on adaptability had struggled to accept that the world had changed beneath its hulls. Lee's battle had proven a truth larger than victory, that technology, when married to training and imagination, could multiply human power. That truth would become the foundation of modern warfare, but too late for the ships that had earned it. In the decades that followed, historians pieced together the fragments. They discovered Lee's reports, his diagrams, his precise descriptions of radar integration. Naval scholars began calling the Guadalcanal engagement the first modern sea battle. A handful of documentaries aired. A few chapters were written. But the public never knew. Even today, visitors to Pearl Harbor hear of Arizona and Missouri, the tragedy and the triumph. No guide speaks of Washington. No monument stands for the ship that fought alone. And yet, her legacy remains indelible to those who understand what she proved. She demonstrated that one ship, properly led, properly trained, and properly equipped, can change the course of history. She showed that courage is amplified, not replaced by technology. That innovation is not the opposite of tradition, but its evolution. Her story is not a eulogy for the battleship. It is a warning about the blindness of institutions, the danger of comfort, and the cost of refusing to see. In 1980, a retired radar officer who had served on Washington visited the Naval Museum at Annapolis. He searched the exhibits for any mention of the ship that had made him believe in the future. He found none. When asked what he thought, he simply said, "We learned to see in the dark." Then they turned the lights back on and forgot why. The Battle of Guadalcanal was not just a turning point of a war, it was a turning point of thought. It asked one question that still echoes through every age of technology. Will we learn from what saves us? Or will we forget it the moment it works? The Navy's answer was silence. And in that silence, The ghosts of Iron Bottom Sound keep whispering, reminding anyone who will listen that progress, once ignored, never forgives. Time has a way of erasing names. Ships become steel. Steel becomes dust. And men who once commanded the night become stories that few remember. But truth endures even when memory does not. 82 years have passed since USS Washington sailed into the darkness off Guadalcanal and changed the course of a war. Her hull is gone, her crew long departed, her name unspoken in classrooms or museums. Yet her legacy moves through every warship that sails today, through every radar pulse that pierces fog, every missile guided by unseen hands, every sailor who fights an enemy he cannot see. Admiral Willis did not live to see the world he helped shape. He did not see radar evolve into the nervous system of the modern Navy, or watch information replace armor as the weapon of power. He did not see how his quiet defiance, his refusal to fight by the old rules, would become the standard for every commander who dared to think for himself. But maybe he didn't need to, because in that November night, he had already proven the only truth that ever mattered. That courage and clarity can exist together. That discipline and innovation are not enemies, but allies. That the future belongs to those who are willing to see it before others do. Washington's perfect record still stands unmatched. In every battle she fought from the Atlantic to the far Pacific, not a single man aboard her was killed by enemy action. Not one. It was not luck. It was mastery of machines, of training, of leadership, and above all, of trust, between men, between technology, between a commander and the future he believed in. Wars end, lessons fade, but some nights stay lit forever. That night, off Guadalcanal, amid fire and chaos, one ship saw through the dark and did the impossible. And though the world may have forgotten her name, the truth she revealed still guides the ships that followed. Technology changes, weapons evolve, but the challenge remains the same: to see clearly when others cannot, to trust reason over ritual, to have the courage to defy doctrine when the world depends on it. Because history is not just what happens, it's what we choose to remember. So, remember Washington, remember Willis, and remember what they proved. That the future is won not by those who follow the rules of yesterday, but by those who can see beyond them.